I had actually thought about this story for years before starting to work on the book in any kind of official capacity. Um, I, I worked on Steve Young's autobiography I started that about 7 years ago. And while working with Steve, I started thinking really seriously about the Patriots. And then after writing Tiger Woods' biography, which came out a couple years ago, I immediately finally turned my attention to this and started in the summer of 2018. So coming off the Patriots' loss to the Eagles in the Super Bowl is when I started working on this project. And from the beginning, given that so much has been written about this team over the years, and they've probably been the most scrutinized sports franchise in America over the last 2 decades, I thought a lot about what would be a unique and different entry point to this story, to be able to write something that would be fresh and revealing and different, and create a great reading experience for not only New Englanders, but perhaps even people who are just interested in success and in winning, but may not be Patriots fans, or frankly might not even be football fans. And that was why I chose to approach Robert Kraft first and foremost at the start of this project, as the owner of the team and really the architect who built the franchise into what it is today. I thought it would be important and interesting to go to him first and to try to develop that story, because I think that of the 3 key players, he, Belichick, and Brady, I think the role of the owner has probably been least explored and least understood, largely just because he doesn't wear a headset and he doesn't handle the football. So he's not on television. We don't really see his role the way we see the quarterback and the coach. And that was the reason that I chose to structure the book the way I did, to really put him in context with both Brady and Belichick. And I thought also that I wanted to personalize these characters in a way that would introduce readers to them, not just in their sort of football capacity, but who are they as men, and how do their relationships with each other affect the dynasty. And so from the very beginning, I was asking different kinds of questions, and actually doing a lot of observation about the team. Almost in that first year, I spent a lot of time in 2018 just watching and observing, sort of like a fly on the wall. There's a scene in the last chapter of this book, chapter 44, which is called "We're Still Here." And that's the year that they won their 6th Super Bowl. So while I was there was an incident or an experience. Early in the season that year, the Patriots had hosted the Miami Dolphins. And during that game, Mike Pompeo was a guest of Robert Kraft for that game, was sitting in the owner's box. I also was in the owner's box that day. And toward the end of the game, which New England was up way ahead, Mr. Kraft took Mike Pompeo to the locker room to get him in position before the team came off the field and entered the locker room. I followed them into the locker room, and inside, the locker room was empty and quiet, and Mr. Kraft was showing Pompeo around. And in the midst of that, Rob Gronkowski emerged from the training room and came into the locker room. He didn't know anyone was in the locker room, and certainly Kraft and Pompeo didn't know that Gronkowski was in the training room. And when he came in, Mr. Kraft introduced Rob to Mr. Pompeo, and then they had a discussion. And then a few minutes later, the team came in, and Bill Belichick went right over to Gronkowski, because he had a big ice pack bandaged around his lower leg, and you could see blood actually through the transparent ice bag. It was clear that he'd been hurt in the game, and Belichick came over to check on him, and I just sat there and listened and watched all that. And then as they huddled around Coach Belichick for the Lord's Prayer, which they do after every game, That was also wide receiver Josh Gordon's first game, and I watched as everybody knelt down. Robert Kraft took one of Josh Gordon's hands, and Mike Pompeo took his other hand, and then Tom Brady essentially stood behind them. And I was thinking as I sat there, you know, where else in the National Football League would a new player like Josh Gordon come into an organization where in his first game he would literally kneel between the Secretary of State and the owner of the team and enter into the Lord's Prayer being led by Coach Belichick with Tom Brady standing behind him. It was, I start out with that experience just to say that the opportunity to watch the team and to observe and see these kinds of moments really enabled and helped me be able to tell a narrative that I think was more intimate and was less about sort of what I think about this team or these guys and just more about really who they are. And it's essentially what I saw and what I experienced and observed as a writer. There's one other thing I'd like to do, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Before I take questions, I'd like to just read a very brief excerpt and then say a couple words about why I chose this particular scene to open the book and also how I did it. And then we'll go into questions. This is from the prologue of the book, and it goes as follows. Wearing a surgical mask, a gown, and latex gloves, Dr. David Berger stood over Drew Bledsoe and made a careful incision in his chest. It was the evening of Sunday, September 23rd, 2001, and high-intensity ceiling lights in a trauma bay at Massachusetts General Hospital illuminated the 37-year-old surgeon's steady hands. Bledsoe, the starting quarterback for the New England Patriots, had an oxygen cannula in his nose and IV fluids flowing into his veins to resuscitate him. The 29-year-old had lost over a third of his blood through a partially severed artery that was pulsing into his chest cavity and preventing his left lung from expanding. Berger needed to get the internal bleeding under control, or Boston's most famous athlete would die. But first, he had to remove the blood from Bledsoe's chest. Inserting a slim tube in the incision, Berger gingerly snaked it under Bledsoe's skin, over a rib, and into the space between the lung and the chest wall where the blood was pooling. Within moments, blood began flowing from Bledsoe's chest through the tube into a machine equipped with filters that removed clots and other impurities. The machine then retransfused the clean blood back into Bledsoe through a second tube that flowed into one of his veins. As soon as Bledsoe's lungs started working again, Berger turned his attention to the sheared artery. When a patient loses 1.5 liters of blood, standard medical protocol calls for surgery to stop the bleeding. But Bledsoe wasn't a standard patient. He was the most talented quarterback in team history and had just signed a 10-year, $103 million contract that made him the highest paid player in the National Football League. Reluctant to operate, Berger talked to Bledsoe and his wife, Maura, together. The injury, he explained, was to Drew's left chest. When a right-handed thrower like Drew brought the ball back, cocked his arm, and then extended it forward, he was rotating around on his left chest, using all of those muscles to generate the torque to throw. I will have to cut at least some of those muscles, Berger told Drew. Then Berger turned to Maura. The procedure could potentially end his football career, he told her. Bledsoe was adamant that he didn't want surgery. Berger explained that sometimes an artery will stop bleeding on its own, averting the need for surgery. Under the circumstances, Berger recommended keeping the chest tube in and closely monitoring Bledsoe. If the bleeding didn't stop within a few hours, he'd have no choice but to go in. 2 hours earlier, Berger had been at home, enjoying a quiet dinner with his family, when he received a call from Dr. Tom Gill, a New England Patriots team physician. Berger and Gill were friends. At Gill's urging, the Patriots had started using Berger as a surgical consultant a couple of years earlier. Berger had a reputation for being the busiest surgeon at Mass General, where he performed about 800 operations a year. The moment he heard Gill's voice, Berger knew this wasn't a social call. "Can you meet Drew over at MGH emergency room?" Gill said in an urgent tone. Berger asked what was going on. Gill said he wasn't sure. Late in the fourth quarter, he explained, Bledsoe had been running with the ball toward the Patriots sideline when he was blasted by New York Jets linebacker Mo Lewis. The hit was so violent that players along the Patriots sideline compared the sound of the collision to a car crash. Bledsoe went airborne, and his face mask bent. After lying on the turf for a minute or so, he finally got up and made his way to the bench. He returned to the field on the Patriots' next possession, but Coach Bill Belichick replaced him moments later when it became apparent that Bledsoe couldn't remember the plays. When the game ended, he was taken to the locker room to be examined. X-rays were inconclusive, but his vital signs were troubling. High heart rate, faint pulse, shallow breathing. He was complaining of pain in his left chest and was beginning to be short of breath. "I think he has an internal injury," Gill told Berger, wondering aloud if Bledsoe might have ruptured his spleen. Berger knew that Bledsoe was the linchpin of the Patriots team, the face of the franchise. "He's on his way to the hospital?" Berger asked. "We're putting him in an ambulance now," Gill said. "I'll be there." The Patriots' backup quarterback, Tom Brady, used the locker next to Bledsoe's in the team locker room. While changing out of his uniform after the game, Brady watched the medical staff escort Bledsoe from the training room. Brady was 24 and had just begun his second season in the NFL. He'd seen some big hits in college, but nothing like the one Bledsoe had sustained, and the sight of his friend and mentor being placed on a gurney and loaded into the back of an ambulance had him deeply concerned. Brady and Bledsoe were close. Brady often hung out at Bledsoe's home, and Maura Bledsoe frequently cooked him dinner. He felt like he was part of the Bledsoe family. Brady quickly got dressed and drove straight from the stadium to the hospital. It was his first trip to Mass General. Unrecognizable in Boston, Brady had trouble getting past security at the nurses' station outside the trauma unit. He had to convince the hospital staff that he was Drew Bledsoe's backup. Eventually, he talked his way in and followed signs to the waiting room where he discovered Maura alone and crying. Brady put his arms around her. "What's going on?" he asked. Wiping her eyes, Maura brought him up to speed. "They're deciding whether to go in and repair the artery," she said. "If it doesn't stop bleeding on its own, it could be career-ending." Brady couldn't believe what he was hearing. Down the hallway, Robert Kraft huddled with one of the team doctors who were closely monitoring the situation. Kraft wanted to know the prognosis. The doctor was direct. Mo Lewis's hit, he explained, had resulted in an injury unlike anything he'd ever seen in a professional athlete. When Lewis hit Bledsoe, he broke a number of his ribs, despite the fact that Bledsoe was wearing a flak jacket. The jagged edges of the broken ribs tore an artery in Bledsoe's chest, causing internal bleeding. The official medical diagnosis was that Bledsoe suffered a hemothorax, a collection of blood in the space between the chest wall and the lung. Roughly 50% of the blood circulating through Bledsoe's body ultimately leaked into his chest and needed to be drained. He also had a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung. Apparently, one of his broken ribs had poked a hole in it. The doctor told Kraft that Bledsoe could have died. Stunned, Kraft had trouble keeping his emotions in check. Bledsoe was like a son to him. Kraft doubted he'd ever play football again. Gathering himself, he briefed Belichick, who had also come straight from the stadium. Belichick had seen his fair share of serious injuries, but Bledsoe's situation was the worst. In that moment, Belichick wasn't thinking about football. He was just hoping Bledsoe would pull through. Determined to stay until Bledsoe was stable enough to have visitors, Kraft and Belichick ducked into a waiting area. It was going to be a long night. At around midnight, nurses told Kraft, Belichick, and Brady that they could see Bledsoe. He slept as they quietly filed into his room and took their places beside his hospital bed. Blood was still flowing from the tube in his chest through the machine and back into one of his veins. He had an IV in his arm. Maura sat beside him, gently stroking his right hand. Kraft, Belichick, and Brady stood shoulder to shoulder over Bledsoe's left side. After a few minutes, Bledsoe opened his eyes. Groggy and disoriented, he first spotted Maura. She smiled and squeezed his hand. Then he turned his head to the left and looked up to see Mr. Kraft, Coach Belichick, and Tommy gazing down at him. Confused and still experiencing the effects of powerful pain medication, Bledsoe wasn't sure what they were doing there. To him, they looked like a vision from another time and place. At that moment, Kraft owned a franchise that had never won a championship. Belichick's overall record with the Patriots was 5-13. Brady had never started an NFL game. It was unimaginable to think that Bledsoe was staring up at the nucleus of the greatest sports dynasty of the modern era. That's the prologue, and I chose to open the book that way for a couple of reasons, but the primary one being, well, two. The two primary reasons being, one, first of all, the drama that is taking place there is so significant and so intimate. And number two, there's a dramatic historical moment that's playing out here, which at that moment, nobody realized its historical significance, but this is a watershed moment, not just for the New England Patriots, but for the entire National Football League. What's about to happen because of this injury and what it triggers, to me, was the ushering in of the greatest winning tradition the NFL has ever seen. And so that's why I chose to open it there. It's such an unlikely moment. And also, in terms of crafting this particular part of the story, I had the opportunity to interview all 6 people who are in that room. Drew and Maura Bledsoe, Dr. Berger, the surgeon, and then, of course, Robert Kraft, Coach Belichick, and Tom Brady. I thought it was really important to have all of their voices in that scene and have talked to all of them about that moment, because if I'm choosing to open the book there, I really wanted the perspective as best I could of all the participants who were in the room. And it gives a real intimate feel, and I think a signal to the reader that this is the kind of book this is going to be. It is intimate. It is as if you are inside the room, and it's told from the perspective of the participants. Not my perspective necessarily, but from the perspective of those who live through these moments. So without any further ado, I'll open it up and would be happy to take questions that you may have.
Well, thank you for that. And I told you I read your book. I for those in the audience, I inhaled this book. As a Patriots fan and having lived through all of it, it was great. But what really struck me was that as you in your opening remarks, you made this point. We as fans tend to focus on the coach and the quarterback, and we debate about the greatest of all time and the GOAT conversation. But in many ways, I, for one, and maybe all of us, tend to overlook what's probably the biggest component of all, and that's the ownership. And you start the book by Robert Kraft paying a lot of money for a team that is the laughingstock of the National Football League, and within 25 years has now won as many Super Bowl titles as the Pittsburgh Steelers did in 4 decades. Is this the biggest underdog story since, I don't know, Buster Douglas? I mean, this is a team that was absolutely the dregs of the NFL and was this close to moving to St. Louis, and now they've become the absolute gold standard for pro sports.
Yeah, that's exactly. I think that the Kraft element is so fascinating because, obviously, because you've read the book, that I go back prior to when buying the team was a big deal, because at the time it seemed like he'd paid an obscene amount of money for a team that was the worst team in the NFL and that was playing in the worst stadium in the NFL. And so it just seemed like such an irresponsible, almost ridiculous thing that he had done. But of course, that everybody looks at that differently now, because it's now the only franchise in all of American sports, so not just football, all American sports, there's only one franchise that's worth more money than the New England Patriots today, and that's the Dallas Cowboys. And it's close. Um, when you think about that, the Patriots are now worth more than the Yankees, than the Los Angeles Lakers. It's an incredible, the New York Giants, it's an incredible turnaround that they've undergone in such a short period of time, both on and off the field. But in order to really heighten that and to really illustrate how big of a deal this is, what's been accomplished, I wanted to go all the way back to way before Robert Kraft owned the team. In fact, before he was anybody, back when he was just Bobby, a kid growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts, growing up in a home where they couldn't afford a house, so they rented, where they couldn't afford a television, they couldn't afford a car. That's the kind of house that Bobby Kraft grew up in. And I went back to there because I thought it's really important for people to see, like, this isn't someone who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Quite the contrary. This is someone who worked and scrapped and dreamed. And in many ways, it's a great American dream story, just following how Kraft evolved. And so that opening scene in chapter 2, where young Bobby Kraft, a college student at Columbia, comes home for the weekend, and walks into a diner in Back Bay around midnight with 3 of his college buddies. And while they're looking at the menu board to pick out food, he's looking at a pretty girl in line in front of him and wondering, how can I get her to go out with me? That, to me, I started there because I thought this is a great foreshadowing of what this guy is all about and what he's done with the Patriots, because within 24 hours of laying eyes on this complete stranger that he's trying to figure out how to get her phone number, really, by the next night, she is proposing marriage to him. And that is such an unthinkable turn of events. It seems fictitious, but when you look at what's happened in New England with this team and with Belichick and with Brady, all of that could be scripted by a Hollywood screenwriter. It almost seems made up. But so much of it is rooted in the way Kraft went about trying to get his hands on this team, trying to get control of the franchise, and then how he built the franchise before Belichick and Brady arrived.
And in that same vein, you make it a point that this really is a family business, that throughout all of it, we clearly see Jonathan being involved today, but Myra was there from the get-go. And even through all of it, you tell the story of Bledsoe and his then fiance, Maura, coming to, being invited to Kraft's house for dinner. And Bledsoe who said and never even met the previous owner, figures he's going to get this, this great dinner, and once sees Myra making it in the kitchen. That seems to be a thread throughout all of the book. This is a family business.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up. One of the interesting things, my publisher, Simon & Schuster, after the publisher read it, so not my editor, but the publisher read my book, which that alone was sort of gratifying for me to know that he took the time to read it. And he sent me this note, and he said, when I come away from reading this book, it's so much about family. And yeah, it's about a football team, but this is really a book about family. And I was glad he said that or got that out of it, because as I was writing it, that's so much of a theme that I wanted to bleed through the narrative. And also the role of women. Whenever you talk about football, you rarely even mention women. It's like they're not part of the game and the conversation. But women played a really important role in this story. And starting with Myra Kraft, she has a profound impact on the dynasty in every way. And because of the kind of marriage that she and Robert had, this really remarkable love story that is part of the backdrop of this football team. To Robert's credit, Myra is a huge part of the Patriots team when he buys the franchise. You mentioned the Drew Bledsoe story, and I'll pick up on it because it's a great illustration of what I'm talking about. When Robert bought the team, and Drew was already there. When he bought the team, Kraft inherited Bill Parcells as his head coach and Drew Bledsoe as his quarterback. Those two guys had showed up a year before Robert bought the team. So naturally, one of the things that Robert wanted to do was build a relationship, a more personal relationship with his quarterback. And so he invited Drew and his then fiance, Maura, to his home for dinner. The invitation alone kind of stunned Bledsoe. He told me, he said, I had never even met the prior owner of the team, James Orthwine, who resided in St. Louis. So it was a big deal to get invited. And of course, Drew and his fiance had these perceptions about what it was going to be like to go to Robert's home for dinner. They knew he was wealthy, and they figured there were going to be servants and cooks and chefs and people in tuxedos and white tablecloths and a, catered dinner kind of thing. And he said, we got there, and literally it was just Maura and I and Robert and Myra Kraft, and we were in their kitchen. Myra was cooking dinner, homemade food, and then the four of us sat at a table just off the kitchen and had dinner. And for a couple of hours, we just talked. There was no one else there. There's no servants, there's no cooks, there's no anybody else. And Drew said that one of the things that stood out to him, and this says a lot about Drew as well, but he noticed that throughout the evening, multiple times, Robert reached over and took Myra's hand and was like rubbing her hand. It was more reflexive. It was almost like he was doing it subconsciously, which said to Drew and Maura that these two people are really in love with each other. And it made a huge impression on Drew and Maura because they were about to get married, and there was almost some modeling going on, although that's not what Robert and Myra were trying to do. It was one of the consequences of having them in their home for dinner. This kind of sort of relationship building that Robert and Myra did with their players, you really see this when Tom Brady comes into the picture, and they build that kind of relationship with Tom. The difference is, of course, Tom is there a lot longer than Drew, and you really see this relationship evolve and deepen over time. But it's the kind of thing that Robert and Myra did with a lot of players. Teddy Bruschi, Willie McGinnis. I mean, it just goes on and on. Randy Moss. And so I tried to show that in the narrative because it really shows the impact that an owner and his wife can have on the success of a franchise.
Yeah, and to that vein, you said it was really Myra that was the inspiration for doing a lot of community service, and that becomes kind of a stipulation with all of them. You mentioned a name that I don't know if it gets forgotten, but maybe a little bit overlooked. I'm not sure Bill Parcells came across as really good in this book. I mean, he seemed to be kind of a classic bully, or the old school NFL. Is that fair to say? Or he certainly was a clash of cultures, he and Kraft.
No question, it's a clash of cultures. It's a clash of eras. Look, Bill Parcells was the greatest coach in the game at the time that Kraft bought the team. I think that Parcells and Bill Walsh from the 49ers were the two preeminent coaches of that time period. Walsh has retired and is no longer coaching in San Francisco by the time Kraft buys the Patriots. So Parcells is clearly the king of coaches. But there is a huge culture clash because Bill is the old guard of the NFL. Robert Kraft is the new guard. He and his son, Jonathan, who's this very young, new executive, Robert basically puts him in position to be the president of the team right when he buys it. And they're looking at football very differently than how Bill Parcells looks at football. Bill is a coach. Robert is a seasoned executive who's run all kinds of businesses around the world, shipping, paper, packaging. He's a citizen of the world at this point, and he knows how to run big organizations. The Patriots were in deep financial trouble and had all kinds of problems. And he's just spent $173 million, a record purse for a team. And so his approach to running the team and the finances is very different than what Bill Parcells is focused on. And so they do clash. And the clash is instant, and it also involves Jonathan. So there's a lot going on here. And this goes on for 3 years. But I think, look, to Bill's credit, he is the great coach, and he takes umbrage that an owner who has no prior experience in professional football has come in, but he doesn't seem to appreciate the fact that Kraft has bought a team that was headed for oblivion and was about to move to St. Louis, and so there are some growing pains for sure, and I went right into that because there's tremendous drama there. I think the tension between the Krafts and Parcells is there's a lot of fertile ground there for understanding what was going on in Foxborough. And it's also a table setter for what would happen later with Belichick, because Kraft learns a lot. It wasn't fun by any means, but he learned a lot from his experience with Parcells that prepared him and weathered him for what would come with Belichick.
Kraft was also mortgaged to the hilt, which also gets kind of forgotten at the time. You mentioned about going to the family thing with Jonathan. It's interesting too that Jonathan and Tom Brady basically walk parallel paths. I mean, they almost refer to each other as brothers. They kind of grew up together. Talk about that.
I love the relationship between Brady and Kraft, and I wanted to. And when I say Kraft, in this case, Jonathan Kraft. I wanted to develop that as best I could. And I think there's one scene in particular in this book that really, for me, sort of captured how these two feel about each other. And it's interesting. Jonathan Kraft is a very low profile guy. He keeps quiet. He's extremely hardworking, extremely smart, but not someone that you typically see or hear in the media. And there's this great scene in 2010. So Tom Brady's now been with the team for a decade. He's coming off season-ending surgery in 2008. He came back in 2009 and played his first year after surgery. And now it's the off season after 2009. So it's at that point where most quarterbacks that have played a decade and had a terrible knee injury like he had, their career is essentially now starting to wind down. In fact, Tom Brady's kind of at that time would be considered on the older side. No one imagined then he'd end up playing as long as he has, but there's a lot of concern on Tom's part about how much longer Bill Belichick's going to want him as the Patriots quarterback. And he's very familiar with how Belichick's history is of jettisoning players as they start to get older. And he'd done that with Adam Vinatieri, with Willie McGinnis, with Ty Law, with Lawyer Malloy. So he'd seen this, and Brady's thinking that it could be his turn next. And his contract is also up for renewal. So there's a lot of angst. Robert invited Tom out to Cape Cod that summer. It was during training camp. They had some days off. Robert reached out to Tom and invited him out to the Cape, where Robert has a summer home. And so Tom went out there. And this is summer of 2010. And they played a round of golf together. And then they went back to Robert's home on the Cape, where Jonathan joined them. And the three of them had lunch. And over lunch, they were talking about Tom's contract situation. And basically, an agreement was made that day. None of this was on paper. It was all verbal. And it was between Robert and Tom, where basically Robert was saying that he would protect Tom and that Tom didn't need to worry about losing his starting position as the Patriots quarterback. If that ever happened, if Belichick ever wanted to move on from him, that Robert Kraft would intervene and enable Tom to go to another team. And so the question then turns to his contract that needs to be negotiated and worked out. And normally, Belichick would be doing that with Tom's agent. But in this case, Tom doesn't want that. And so he turns to Jonathan and he asks Jonathan if he would step in and negotiate his new contract with Tom's agent, Don Yee. And it's an amazing, that says a lot about how Tom feels about Jonathan and how much he trusted him. But also, Jonathan had never done this with any player ever. He'd never been involved in player contract negotiations. That's just not his role. But because it's Tom, he's willing to do it here. And he basically looks at his dad and says, if it's okay with you, I'll do it. And Robert, of course, says that that is okay. And then Jonathan steps in and negotiates Tom's new contract. And it's the contract that sets the stage for Tom to remain in New England for another 10 years. Now, obviously, there were additional contract renewals down the road, but the one in 2010 was the foundation for all that. So to me, that was a great anecdote story that showed the kind of relationship that Jonathan and Tom had. And you also really saw that in the last scene of the book, which I won't go into detail here because I don't want to do a spoiler, but you see it again there.
You mentioned Bill Belichick, and obviously this is the one of the people that we as fans see every Sunday. We see the press conferences, which are always, well, boring, and he's got this kind of gruff, grumpy persona. You had an anecdote in the book that I really jumped off the page to me, and you had referenced some former Patriots, Danny Amendola, for example. Bill can be an expletive deleted, and some non-complimentary things on the way out. And you had a thing that, Bill comes across as this gruff, Billy go gruff here, but it really bothers him that he's sensitive to this. That's something that really kind of struck me. Like this stuff bugs Bill. To talk about that. He's thin. He's not the thinner skin, but this is a side of Bill that we as fans don't normally see.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought that up. And this will seem like a diversion to answering your question, but it's not. This, I think, sets the stage for the other side of Bill. And I put this in the first chapter of the book, which is called Endgame. So the book starts with that hospital scene, which I read earlier. And then chapter 1 is set in the present. It's just a year ago right now. It's September 2019, and they're about to start Tom Brady's last season. And in that chapter, I tell this story. And I'll just read this because it's really interesting. This is set back in 2000 when Bill Belichick is about to coach his first game. And I'll just read this little part. It says, Belichick's first game as head coach of the Patriots was against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Foxborough Stadium on September 3rd, 2000. That morning, Belichick gave Kraft a gift, a vintage photograph of Ted Williams and Babe Ruth. It came with a handwritten note. Robert, thanks for giving me the opportunity to coach your team. Let's hope we will be as successful as these two fellas, Bill. Now, I share that letter with you. It's a note that Bill handwrote to Robert, because when I saw that picture, which still hangs on Robert's office wall, and I saw the note that Bill had written him to go with it, I was really struck by it on a number of levels, because to me, it's a lens, it's a portal into a side of Bill that he doesn't show you. That's not the public Bill Belichick that you see at these press conferences you were talking about. But there's a lot to that note and that picture, at least to me. And so in writing the book, I went around and found a number of instances where you see a side of Bill that is never on public display. For instance, when his dad passed away, there's an incredible series of events that happens when he tells Robert, when he the night before the game, that his dad had just died, when he coaches the game the next day, and then when he tells his players after the game that his father had passed away, and then when Robert steps forward and gives Bill the game ball. And it's very emotional. They embrace, you see how Bill is affected by the gesture from Robert. And then you go to Annapolis a couple days later where Bill delivers the eulogy for his father, and Robert is sitting there with Jonathan. And when Bill sits down after giving this incredibly sort of emotional eulogy, where he also pays tribute to his mother, who's sitting there in the front row, and then as he sits down and Robert kind of pats him on the shoulder. Look, Bill's a human being. And I think that this is what I felt about all three of them, Bill, Tom, Robert. At the end of the day, they're fathers, they're husbands, they're somebody's son. They're human. But they are at the top of an industry that is so high profile and so subject to scrutiny. Bill has to have reptile-like skin. His skin is thick, and sometimes it's unattractive. But he has to have that to be what he is and do what he does. And so I think, under that, there is affection for his players. He does care about these guys. And I think that's the evidence for how his players think about him is not necessarily how they feel when they're there going through what is oftentimes a very sort of frustrating experience playing for him. It's how do they feel after they've left? And I think if you go back and look at players like Teddy Bruschi and Randy Moss and Willie McGinnis and Rodney Harrison, you just keep going down the line. These guys really appreciate and value the fact that they got to play for Belichick.
One of the questions, by the way, if you've got questions, make sure you use the chat feature. So somebody had a question here about Patriot Place shopping, dining, and entertainment complex, and extremely philanthropic. What did you learn about the secrets of his success? And one of the things, by the way, not part of the question, but one of the things, a plug for your book, is you actually say that Robert Kraft envisioned this, that Patriot Place well before all this success came. Well, he envisioned it kind of is in tying in with the success, but he had a plan for this well before they broke ground.
Yeah, Robert's I won't say a lot about it here, but just to say that he's a visionary. I mean, he's very entrepreneurial. And I think that that's one of the things that NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, who was the commissioner when Robert bought the team in the early 90s, one of the things that Commissioner Tagliabue saw in Robert very early on was his entrepreneurial nature and the fact that he had such a diverse business background. It was what distinguished him in Commissioner Tagliabue's eye from a lot of the other owners in the NFL. They were sort of one-dimensional in their business backgrounds. Robert wasn't. He was very different. And the visionary part of it it's so evident when you go to the stadium today and you look at this team and the kinds of things they're doing that no one else is doing. On and off the field. So much of that really comes from Kraft.
You do also bring up the dark side of success. You talk about, in your book, you talk about Deflategate, you talk about Spygate, you bring up the incident with Robert Kraft in Florida. As the question goes, I see the good things, but where'd the bad stuff come from? What's?
Yeah, not sure what the question, where did it come from, means. Look, this is a 20-year run of excellence in a cutthroat competitive industry. There's nothing like professional football for its competitiveness. And when you get to the top of the mountain, everybody's gunning for you. And these guys have been up there for 2 decades. I think that Spygate, which is the first sort of controversy that the Patriots were involved in, and took place in 2007, they were accused of taping an opponent, the New York Jets, in the first game of that season. What they were doing is something that everybody was doing in the NFL. And the reason I say that is because it was so pervasive that the NFL sent out a memo to all the teams telling them to knock it off. I mean, that's what happened that summer. That the league sent out a memo because basically everybody was doing this. And the Patriots in the first game of that season got caught still doing it or some version of it. And they acknowledged that they did it, and the NFL came down really hard on them. Bill Belichick got the biggest fine in the history of the NFL for a coach, and the team was sanctioned. And probably most importantly, their reputation took a hit, and suddenly everybody was calling into question the 3 Super Bowls they'd won years earlier, as if there was some connection, which there wasn't. But the point is that this did happen. And so that's something that stuck with them. And I thought it was important. If you look at what happened in that year in 2007, the taping happened in the very beginning of the first game of the season. So in the first half of the first game. That's the season that the Patriots went 16-0. And they didn't just beat teams that year, they annihilated them. That was the year with the largest discrepancy in scores in Patriots history. They were just blowing teams out. And then we know they marched through the playoffs and then lost a heartbreaker to the New York Giants. But the idea that this sideline taping of the defensive coach's hand signals had something to do with the winning was obviously not a thing. The league even acknowledged that, by the way, when they sanctioned them. The commissioner, who was then Roger Goodell by that point, said that they found no evidence that the taping that the Patriots had done had any bearing on that game. It didn't. But there was a mark now. And of course, years later, well, not years later, that year, at the end of that season before the Super Bowl, the Boston Herald accused the Patriots of illegally taping the Rams in that first Super Bowl back in 2002. This story was believed because of what had happened earlier in 2007 with the Jets. But it turned out that the story the Herald ran was false. The Patriots did not tape the Rams at the Super Bowl in 2002. It was made up. There was no tape. The Herald later admitted that in front page and back page headlines where they apologized to the team. But by then, the damage was done. The fact is, the allegations about the Super Bowl taping were far more damaging to the Patriots' reputation than the Jets situation. And to this day, people still cite the Rams game as the best evidence that the Patriots are a cheating organization, although that whole thing was made up. It was fabricated. And so by the time you get to Deflategate in 2014-15, one of the things I say in the book is I really believe that if there had been no Spygate, there never would have been a Deflategate. It never would have gotten the traction that it did, and it never would have become what it did, the kind of so-called scandal that it was. But the bottom line is, as a writer, I felt it was really important to document and go through Spygate, the whole Aaron Hernandez saga, which is between Spygate and Deflategate, and then Deflategate, because those 3 episodes are in the middle years of this great dynasty. And I think the takeaway is of the perseverance of this team to just keep pressing on. And they use adversity, unlike any other organization, to motivate and galvanize and build that team culture.
Yeah, I'm not sure John Tomasi, who wrote the story, or Marshall Falk has ever gotten over that. As you're with the team in 2018, looking back, did you have a crystal ball figuring that the end was near between Tom, between Bill, between the Patriots? As you're watching this from afar, if you're the fly on the wall, did you think Tom Brady would retire a Patriot, or did you think there would be a divorce, amicable or otherwise?
I certainly didn't have a crystal ball. And honestly, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. I had so much to do. It's so much work to do. And so, to me, the magnitude of this project was so kind of overwhelming. I didn't have time to waste thinking about what might happen in the future. I was too focused on what I had to do in the present. And so I just knew that at some point that thing would work itself out, and then I would write about it. But I really didn't waste a lot of time wondering about how it was all going to go down, because I had no idea. And I had the sense, as I was working on the book, that no one else did either, even inside the organization. It was playing itself out, and there was a sense that it would work itself out at some point, which is often how things like this go. And so I wasn't fixated on it. I had no premonition that this was going to go the way it went. I was just, frankly, I was grateful to be there while it was happening and to be able to document it in real time.
Obviously, if you're under the age of 30, you've only seen success. That the AFC Championship game you think is a regularly scheduled game on the Patriots schedule. If you're over the age of 30, you kind of remember the bad times. Is it safe to say we will never see a 20-year run like this again certainly in the NFL, but maybe in any sport?
I think that's a safe projection. And I'm not one to make projections, but I think occasionally we see things in sports that are so unusual, so unprecedented. Secretariat, the Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle era Yankees, Muhammad Ali, the run of Tiger Woods. And I think the Patriots dynasty is in that pantheon of unprecedented occurrences in sports. I don't think we'll ever see another run, certainly in the annals of the NFL, like the one that Kraft and Belichick and Brady just went on for 20 years. I just don't think we'll see that again. And I think the further we get away from it, if you're a Patriot fan, the more you cherish it. And if you're everybody else, it's all the other football fans in the country, I think the further you get away from it, you have to, at some point, respect the fact that this, even if you hate them, you got to respect the fact that these guys did something that's never been done before and will probably never be done again.
I think it's safe to say that the NFL they may not love them, but be careful what you wish for. When they're not in the Super Bowl, the ratings are down. So you may not love them, but you'll watch them.
Yeah.
I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. As I said, this book is a fabulous read. If you're a Patriots fan, it's a great book. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. The book is named The Dynasty. His name is Jeff Benedict. Everyone stay safe. Thank you for joining us. Good, and continued good luck with this book.
Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone.